Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the PokePopCast. Today we're going to start a series of reviewing the organized play documents, and we're going to start with the penalty guidelines because that's the document that judges on a day-to-day basis will need to refer to the most. We'll look at the first sections before we get into the meat of specific types of infractions and talk about the philosophy behind penalties and how Pokemon wishes them to be seen and acted upon. Before we get into the penalty guidelines, let's talk about what a judge is at a tournament for, what your function is, not just the nitty-gritty, but the overall high end here. So at Pokemon trading card game events, Pokemon wants the events to be fun, fast, fair, following the spirit of the game. So the main function of the judge is to ensure that's happening. The function of the tournament organizer is to set up the tournament, get the venue arranged, make sure that supplies are available, that the staff is there, that the tournament can be run and run successfully. But the judges are there kind of like the conductor on a train. We're there moving the tournament along. When you're acting as a judge, you're going to get two or three main types of interactions with players, right? So number one is players are going to ask for rulings on cards, card interactions, how this card works, how this and that card interact, what would happen if this, right? And that takes a certain amount of knowledge, and we can start talking about, I'll save that for another podcast on getting good with using the resources to answer those kind of questions. But the other main interaction you're going to have with the player is, this was done wrong, what needs to be done now to fix it and to move forward with the tournament. Or hopefully not too much of this, but you may have players behaving badly and you need to step in and stop them from behaving badly and get them back on track, or hopefully not too often eject them from the tournament if they're behaving badly enough and issue a disqualification. So I guess that's three main types of interactions. And the penalty guidelines deals mainly with the latter two. If you're answering rulings questions and you're helping the players do things correctly, there's no penalty involved in that. It's when things go wrong that we need to step in, correct the game state, and make sure that things are done are corrected as much as possible. And we'll get into more when we get into the details with the different types of penalties and the different levels of penalties of how badly the game state is damaged and how much you can repair the game state. But by and large, you want to repair the game state as much as possible, and then as part of that, issue a penalty to reflect that something wrong happened and needed to be fixed. All right, so that's really what the penalty guidelines are about. Guidelines for how to do that part of the judge function. So we're going to go through here the various sections, and in going through the various sections, pay attention to, I've mentioned it in a previous podcast, my rule number 0. What are we trying to accomplish here? And the main thing we're trying to accomplish here is to have a fair and fun event. So we need to keep both of those. Keeping those things in mind when you're making rulings and interacting with players is of prime importance. And if your interactions with players constantly is grating to them, two things are going to happen. Either they're going to stop coming to events, and the tournament organizer, if they're oblivious to what's going on, is going to say, oh, I don't know, Pokemon's not so popular here. Or they're going to realize that you're part of the problem and you're going to be not judging for that organizer anymore and not invited to other events. So it's important when you are applying the penalty guidelines to keep in mind that the main function is to keep the event running smoothly and have a good interaction with the players as much as possible. Are there going to be times you're going to need to be stern with a player? Yes. But I will caution you that if it gets to that point, you really need to bring in higher level people as much as possible. If you're not the head judge, or even if you bring in the head judge, even if you are the head judge, if you're at a state where you're going to be, especially at a lower level tournament, you're going to be disqualifying a player, you need to be bringing in the tournament organizer for consultation. If you're escalating very high DQs, consult. And whether that's consult with the people on hand, you'll also want, and we'll talk more general issues, but you'll want to have people that you can call, that you respect as judges, and call for advice on rulings if they're not present. I have people that I call for advice on rulings. So everybody should have somebody that they respect, that they can call and reach out to for advice. All right, that's a really strong piece of advice from me. Nobody needs to do this alone. All right, let's get into the penalty guidelines. Section 1, assigning penalties. The first thing Pokemon directs judges to do is to create a fun, safe, and non-stressful environment. Okay, so that's good advice in general. Basically, the players are our customers, but as a judge, our reason for being there is to ensure that things are being done properly. But we must do that in a way that's respectful to the players and that is not stressful, or no more stressful than it needs to be. As part of that, one of the things that needs to be done is any serious penalty needs to be addressed with a player in private if possible. We don't want to have a spectacle out on the floor. We don't want to embarrass the player. We want to deal with things privately so that the player is not embarrassed if possible. Because the main thing that Pokemon assumes when issuing penalties is that the error being dealt with, unless it's cheating, that the error was unintentional. Okay? So, number one direction, every time a penalty is assigned, it should be accompanied with an explanation. All right? That's important. You want to explain to the player what they did wrong, why, if possible, show them in the penalty guidelines where the penalty falls, and if it happens to be one of the examples, show the example, why it is getting the penalty it is, because it has damaged the game state, because an error has been repeated again and again, so therefore it's a higher penalty than normal. Whatever's going on, it needs to be explained to the player, and it's important to ask the player, do they understand what's been explained to them? There's nothing worse than handing a penalty, moving on, and the player has no idea why they got the penalty they got. Just leads to bad feelings. So Pokemon sees basically there being two main levels of tournaments that RNOR play. There are the Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 refers mainly to grassroots level events, local events held at a store, which would be sanctioned, but don't necessarily have championship points involved in them. Ones that have championship points involved, even if they do, league challenges and league cups are still lower level events. And Pokemon sees those as a learning experience, which is why they start with a lower penalty. Judges should take more into account the experience level of the players, especially with the younger players. They should take into account that the players are still in a learning mode. They may not have the experience. However, if you're dealing with experienced players, you should generally be holding them to a standard. It's still a lower level event, but you're going to give them less of a benefit of the doubt than a novice player who is possibly making multiple errors just because of their lack of experience. And you can tell the difference. They're unfamiliar. They're hesitant about what they're doing. Just general mistakes that are made because of ignorance of how they should be doing things. And you should be more in a teaching mode with that, not a coaching mode. You can't coach players, but you definitely, with a brand new player, you want to explain to them how things should be done. It's a guideline, so you can go down lower in the penalties rather than give the higher level penalty. But they do need to play properly, and so you do need to at least caution and correct what's going on. The other thing in Section 1 that they deal with is that players, and I've seen this happen, may try to drop from the event in order to avoid the penalty. That's actually a big red flag, and I'll note this to players too. If you're a player and you try to drop to avoid a penalty, rather than getting away from having that penalty on your record, you are in terrible danger of putting a giant red flag over your head that rather than it having been an honest mistake, this was something possibly done on purpose and you're trying to avoid responsibility for it. So, number one, judges do not allow players to avoid getting the penalty because they're dropping. If they drop, they're still getting the penalty. And number two, players, it's really a bad idea to do that. You're just really basically saying to the judge, look out for me in the future because I'm someone to watch out for. And you don't want that around your neck if you can avoid it. Okay, so pro tip for players there. Now the final thing that they mention here in the initial outline is that it is assumed that penalties, errors made are unintentional except for cheating. And there are some penalties that carry a bit more of a bite to them. Even though we're assuming that it's unintentional, in some cases the extra bite is there to make sure that someone is not taking advantage of that assumption. So, for example, the recent change in the draw an extra card penalty. And this is where I caution against judges downsizing that penalty. We'll get to that later. But basically, the penalties, and make it clear to the players. I can't say how many times I've had a player say, I didn't do this on purpose. And the answer to that is, I understand. If I thought you weren't doing it on purpose, we'd be talking about a disqualification rather than whatever penalty we're talking about. So just make it clear to the players that just because we're saying that this happened in the game, we are not saying that they did this on purpose and therefore are cheating. If we're saying they're cheating, then we're going to say they're cheating and we're going to be talking about a disqualification. Now, in sections 2 and 3, I'm going to cover these pretty much together. Section 2 is repeated infractions, and section 3 is multiple infractions. What's the difference between those? Repeated infractions is when a player is doing the same mistake and then they do it again, the exact same mistake, and do it again, the exact same mistake. So maybe they are using an ability when they couldn't use the ability because there's something in play, Garbodor or something with a tool on it that is stopping the players from using abilities. And they've done this now 2 and 3 times during the tournament. So when the players do the same thing again and again, it's important to escalate the penalty, because what that's basically saying is they're not paying attention. Unless there are a few penalties where it said this should not escalate beyond a certain level, if it doesn't give that caution in the guideline, you should be escalating a level each time. Now, obviously, a true error should never raise to the level of disqualification and probably not game loss, but you certainly should not be issuing caution, 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 or even warning, warning, warning with no teeth to it. If the player is making the same mistake again and again, the penalty needs to start getting teeth in it so that they recognize that they are not supposed to be making this mistake multiple times. And I've found that once you issue a prize loss to a player, they really start taking things seriously and pretty much stop making an error. I've encountered players that they've gotten cautions and warnings for the same thing, and they continue doing it. As soon as you escalate, all of a sudden they can handle it, and suddenly now they're not making that mistake. So escalations of penalties are important. Again, you are not giving the player the penalty. The player has earned the penalty. And that's really the way to look at it. You are not doing this to them. They did it to themselves by making the mistake, and you're having to come in and fix things. Multiple infractions is similar, except that it also includes multiple different types of errors. So maybe they used an ability here that they shouldn't have used an ability. They drew an extra card here when they shouldn't have drawn an extra card. They forgot to place prizes. Basically, they're just doing so many things sloppy. And here you need to take into account the difference between a novice player and a player with experience who's just not paying attention. So a novice player you want to be a little more forgiving to, where you're not necessarily escalating because they really are new to tournaments and they're not familiar with things and they're learning. And this is low-level events. You shouldn't really be encountering this at a higher level event. But at a low-level event, you'll encounter it a lot. You get a lot of new players. You want to be a little forgiving there. You still need to issue a penalty. You possibly can downgrade it, and you may not want to escalate penalties for the multiple errors because of the learning experience. But on the other hand, if you have a player who is experienced and they're doing multiple errors, one of the things that's pointed out, and to quote the guidelines, it is important to recognize that some players attempt to gain extra leverage at an event by committing several different errors, quotation marks, accidentally, and these players should be encouraged to discontinue this type of behavior. So what we have here with an experienced player making these kinds of mistakes again and again is maybe they're not really mistakes. We're not going to come out and say, yeah, you're cheating. But it's concerning enough that we want to escalate the penalties because you're an experienced player. You should not be making these kind of errors again and again. And while we are not certain that you are doing this on purpose, the opportunity for it to be for an advantage is high, and therefore you need to escalate the penalties. So bear that in mind as well. You can escalate unrelated penalties if you feel it is appropriate, if the potential is there for the player to be going for advantage. Okay, and the final thing we'll cover today is Section 4, Unreported Infractions. And this is more advice for players than for judges. If the judges don't know that something has happened and players are fixing it themselves, and the judges are not brought in, if your opponent is one of those players who's taking advantage of errors to gain advantage, and the judges don't know about it because they're not brought in, number one, they can't track or see that this player is doing this multiple times. And number two, if now later on in the game something important has happened, we can't fix what happened earlier. We can't take that into account because we weren't there at the time when it happened. You need to bring judges in so that we can take care of issues as they're occurring. Number 5 is talking about reporting penalties to Pokemon Organized Play. If you are a head judge, you do need to be sending in a report, and they give the directions on where to send the report, player coordinator at Pokemon.com. And the added thing of, in the event of a disqualification, not only are you sending in a summary of the penalties, but you must also write a report on what happened. It's a good thing that Pokemon is requiring this because quite often disqualifications at an event can and should lead to stronger penalties against the player, of possibly being suspended from organized play, or the player might be going to Pokemon to complain about the disqualification. So by your having a report put together and sent to them, they're apprised of the situation and know what's going on. So that's an important thing to do. Okay, I think that's where we'll stop today. We'll be getting into the types of penalties and into some more specific penalties in the future, but this is basically going over, we went over today on why we're doing what we're doing, why we're following the penalty guidelines, and what your thinking process should be when you're out on the floor judging the tournament. All right, that's part one, and we'll see you for part two and for the other PokePopcasts. Take care.